Our childhood holds the deepest roots of who we become as adults. The ways we connect with others, the dynamics we engage in, the habits we form, many of these begin long before we're aware of them. They're shaped in the formative years, when we first learn what love, security, and trust mean, and how they are given or withheld. As we grow older, these early experiences mold the lens through which we view our relationships, whether with romantic partners, friends, or colleagues. The process is subtle but profound. It's something that begins in infancy, with the way we're held, the way we're responded to when we cry, when we reach for affection, when we express joy or fear. Over time, the people who surround us shape how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about others. This idea, though well established in psychological theory, is more than a simple cause and effect explanation. It is woven into our psyche, affecting the very nature of who we are and how we interact with the world. John Bowlby, a pioneering psychologist, brought us the concept of attachment theory. Bowlby theorized that the early bonds a child forms with their primary caregivers are foundational to how they approach relationships later in life. If a child's needs are consistently met with warmth, responsiveness, and stability, they begin to develop what's called a secure attachment. This child grows into an adult who is comfortable with closeness, trust, and intimacy. They may not always feel the need to guard their emotions, because their early experiences taught them that vulnerability was safe, that the world, for the most part, could be trusted. But not every child grows up in an environment that offers this kind of safety. For some, the early years are marked by uncertainty. Imagine the child who reaches out to a caregiver for comfort, only to be met with indifference or rejection. Or perhaps the child's caregiver is overwhelmed, unable to meet their needs for emotional support. This creates a deep wound, and over time, it leads to what psychologists call an anxious attachment. For these children, relationships can become a battleground. They may grow into adults who constantly seek reassurance, who worry about being abandoned or unloved, even when there's no clear evidence of such danger. This concept of emotional insecurity in relationships takes us into the realm of Freudian psychology, where Freud spoke of transference, the tendency to project unresolved feelings from our early relationships onto our present-day connections. When someone with an anxious attachment style enters an adult relationship, they may unknowingly recreate the emotional dynamics of their childhood. They might find themselves constantly doubting their partner's affection or becoming overly reliant on them for emotional stability, repeating an old pattern of seeking something that was never fully provided. For others, the wounds are even more profound. Children who experience emotional neglect or abuse, whether from parents who are emotionally unavailable or from caregivers who are unpredictably harsh, may develop what's known as an avoidant attachment. These children learn to hide their emotional needs, retreating into themselves as a form of self-preservation. When these children grow up, they may find it difficult to open up emotionally. They could push others away when things get too close, too intimate, or too vulnerable. There's a fear of being let down, a fear of depending on others because the earliest relationships didn't provide that comfort and safety. In adulthood, the avoidant individual may come across as distant or aloof, not because they lack feelings, but because their earliest experiences taught them to guard their emotions. There's a certain existential resonance in this as well. The existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre suggested that we are all, in a way, alone in our experience of the world. He called it existential isolation, the understanding that, despite our connections with others, we can never fully share our inner worlds. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, this isolation can feel particularly pronounced. They might not trust the world enough to let others in, subconsciously reinforcing the very isolation Sartre describes. It's not necessarily an intellectual choice, but a deep, emotional one, rooted in early abandonment or neglect. Yet, perhaps the most complex attachment style is what's called disorganized attachment. These individuals often come from backgrounds where love and fear are entangled. The caregiver may have been a source of both comfort and terror, perhaps an abusive parent, or someone who alternated between being nurturing and frightening. For the child, there's no consistency. The person they rely on for love and protection is the same person who might cause harm. This creates a chaotic and contradictory emotional world, one that is difficult to resolve. As adults, people with a disorganized attachment may seem unpredictable, their relationships swinging between deep neediness and emotional withdrawal. They may be drawn to relationships that repeat this cycle of chaos and conflict, even when they know on some level that this pattern is unhealthy. In many ways, they are still trying to make sense of the emotional contradictions they faced as children. It is only later in life, sometimes with great difficulty, that they can begin to understand how these patterns were established and how to move beyond them. The profound nature of these early dynamics echoes in the works of Sigmund Freud, who was one of the first to suggest that much of our adult personality is formed in the early years. Freud's ideas about repression, for example, point to how our minds push painful or uncomfortable memories into the unconscious, yet these memories continue to shape us in ways we're not always aware of. If a child experiences trauma or emotional neglect, they may repress those memories, but the unresolved emotional pain can continue to affect their behavior as an adult. It can manifest in a tendency to avoid intimacy, to fear rejection, or to form unhealthy attachments that mirror past hurts. In many ways, the patterns we form as children follow us into our adult relationships, whether we recognize them or not. But these patterns are not predestined. Just because our early years shaped our attachment style doesn't mean we're doomed to live out these dynamics forever. There is always the potential for growth, for healing, and for change. We can become aware of the impact our childhood has on our present lives, and with that awareness comes the possibility of transforming the way we interact with others. In the next part of this exploration, we'll look deeper into how these childhood experiences manifest in adult life, drawing from real-world examples of how people often repeat these patterns. But more importantly, we'll begin to explore how we can start breaking these cycles, how we can reshape our approach to relationships, build healthier attachments, and open ourselves to more fulfilling connections. As we continue our exploration into how childhood experiences shape adult relationships, we can see that the emotional wounds of the past rarely stay hidden. They surface in the most unexpected of ways, often in the very connections we try to build as adults. It's easy to fall into the belief that our past is something we can leave behind, something that only exists as a distant memory. But the truth is far more complex. The way we interact with romantic partners, friends, and colleagues is a direct reflection of the relationships we had in our earliest years. We can deny it, resist it, or try to change it, but unless we understand these influences, we often fall into familiar patterns without even realizing it. Take, for example, a young adult who grows up in an environment where emotional availability is scarce. Perhaps their parents were distant, preoccupied with their own issues, or unable to provide the emotional support needed during formative years. As they move into adulthood, they may find themselves constantly seeking validation from their peers, feeling anxious about their friendships or romantic relationships, despite no real indication of any threat. Their actions may seem irrational at times, calling, texting repeatedly, needing constant reassurance. The root of this behavior lies in the emotional void they faced as children. It's a desperate attempt to fill a gap that was never fully addressed in their early years. In contrast, someone with an avoidant attachment style might show up in a relationship with a significant emotional distance, even if they care deeply. The avoidant adult often views closeness as a potential threat, something that, if allowed too close, might lead to vulnerability and eventually hurt. This stems from early experiences of not having their emotional needs met or being taught to value independence over intimacy. In adulthood, they may push people away, even when they crave deep connection, simply because it feels safer to remain emotionally distant. These dynamics are not only seen in romantic relationships, they bleed into friendships, professional environments, and any space where emotional bonds are formed. Our early experiences prepare us for how we will interact with others in adulthood. For some, the result is a series of short-term relationships that lack depth. For others, it may be long-lasting, but emotionally unfulfilling. These patterns may also play out in the workplace, whether someone overperforms to seek approval or struggles to trust colleagues due to unresolved fears of rejection. We must also recognize that these attachment styles, these early experiences, do not exist in isolation. We live in a complex world where family dynamics, cultural factors, and societal norms deeply influence the way we form relationships. In her influential work, psychologist Sue Johnson emphasized the importance of emotional responsiveness in relationships. She argued that whether we're forming bonds in a romantic relationship or a professional one, it is the emotional accessibility and responsiveness of others that determine how secure we feel. If we grew up with emotionally unavailable caregivers, we might not recognize the subtle cues of emotional attunement in adults. This could leave us vulnerable to poor communication, misunderstandings, and relational breakdowns. But not all is lost. If there's one thing that both psychology and philosophy agree on, it's the potential for growth, healing, and transformation. We're not condemned to forever repeat the patterns of our past. Change is not only possible, it's within our reach. To begin understanding how to transform these patterns, we must first recognize the depth of our emotional wounds. Therapy can be a powerful tool to help us unearth the unconscious beliefs and habits that govern our relationships. Carl Jung famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This recognition is the first step toward healing. Therapy and self-reflection allow us to make sense of how our childhood experiences continue to affect us. For instance, someone who has learned to mistrust their partners due to an anxious attachment style can begin by cultivating self-compassion and slowly learning to trust themselves. They can also work on building healthier boundaries, recognizing that love and trust take time to build, but that trust in themselves is crucial before expecting it from others. For someone with an avoidant style, there's a deep need to learn to be comfortable with vulnerability. It's not about giving up autonomy, but learning to balance the need for closeness with the need for space, recognizing that intimacy doesn't equate to losing oneself. Interestingly, one of the most effective ways of overcoming these ingrained attachment styles is through secure relationships. Research shows that people can begin to heal from insecure attachments when they enter into relationships where the other person is emotionally available and responsive. In such cases, the relationship itself becomes a corrective experience. For someone who grew up with an avoidant attachment, for instance, having a partner who consistently demonstrates emotional availability and understanding can create a new blueprint for how relationships can function. It teaches them that being emotionally open doesn't necessarily lead to harm, and that trust and vulnerability can be sources of strength rather than weakness. But healing doesn't solely depend on others. It also depends on our own willingness to change. In his famous work, The Road Less Traveled, psychiatrist M. Scott Peck proposed that the path to emotional health involves a willingness to embrace both pain and growth. He argued that avoiding discomfort in any form prevents personal transformation. When we stop avoiding the emotional pain that arises from confronting our past, we begin to reclaim control over our future. It's about stepping into the discomfort, acknowledging past wounds, and allowing them to inform but not dictate our behavior. A sense of agency comes from realizing that while our past shapes us, It does not determine us. For someone whose childhood was filled with emotional neglect, learning to value themselves, trust their instincts, and build self-worth is a critical piece of this healing process. It involves creating new narratives about what is possible in relationships, narratives that are based not on fear, but on possibility. It's not about denying the scars we carry, but rather about rewriting our story in a way that acknowledges both the pain and the potential for growth. Furthermore, as much as we may long to change, the process of healing is rarely linear. It involves setbacks, moments of doubt, and frustrations. Change takes time, but the key is to take consistent, conscious action. Building a strong support system of trusted friends, family, or a therapist can also provide the consistency and emotional grounding needed to navigate this transformation. At the same time, we must understand that healing is not only an individual process. Relationships themselves play a vital role in how we heal. In The Art of Loving, Erich Fromm wrote that love is an active force, something that we cultivate with conscious intention, not merely a passive emotion that happens to us. Fromm argued that we all have the capacity to love, but it requires discipline, patience, and a commitment to the growth of both oneself and the other. In relationships, we are challenged to move beyond old wounds and embrace love as a source of healing. By embracing the discipline of love, learning to communicate, to listen, and to understand, we can begin to transform the relationships we have with others and with ourselves. So, what can we do to break the cycle of unhealthy attachment patterns? Start by practicing self-awareness. Reflect on the emotional triggers you experience in relationships and consider how they might be connected to past experiences. Therapy can be a great way to unpack these emotions, helping you understand the root of your feelings. Be patient with yourself as you learn to build trust in your relationships, and remember that healing is a journey, not a destination. And above all, allow yourself to believe that change is possible, because with understanding and effort, your past does not have to define your future. If you found this video helpful and are ready to start understanding how your childhood has shaped your adult relationships, I encourage you to subscribe and share this video with anyone who might benefit from it. Stay tuned for more content on building healthier connections and transforming your emotional well-being.